In this video, I'll go over the different macro lenses I use and why you might want one. The question I'm asked the most is, what lens do you use? And my short answer is, a macro lens. The thing is, I have 4 macro lenses, a 30mm 3.5 Sony, a 50mm f4 Super Takumar, a 70mm 2.8 Sigma, and a 100mm 2.8 Minolta. That's a lot of numbers, but don't worry, I'll break it down. The first number is the focal length, which determines the angle of view, or how much of the scene is in the frame. The second number is the lens's widest aperture, which controls exposure and depth of field. A true macro lens is one that can reproduce at 1:1 magnification and is designed to be sharp at a close distance. A 1:1 of a LEGO minifigure is this big in the frame, a headshot in portrait terms, or a close-up. I generally find myself shooting at 1:3 magnification because I like to have the whole minifig in the scene. I'm rarely shooting at 1:1. The minimum focusing distance is the closest you can get to a subject and be in focus. It's measured from the sensor. The sensor's position is marked on the camera with that O and a line through it. The working distance is the space between the front of the lens and the subject in focus. You can see I have very little working distance with my 30mm lens for a close-up shot. Here's the view from the other camera. So already you can see that the minifig is quite dark. There's not a lot of light hitting it, and it's really easy to cast a shadow over this. I'm going to bring a light in here, which helps a lot, but look at how much room I have and where I need to put the light source. This is pretty limiting. More so if I wanted to introduce some practical effects like rain. There's not really enough space for me to spray here without also hitting my unprotected lens with water. I can pull the camera back, which will mean less magnification. The minifig is much smaller in the frame. But I have a better working distance. There's more space, so I have more choices about where to put this light, for example. Here's my 70mm macro lens with the barrel fully extended to get 1:1 magnification. I've got a lot more working distance than with my 30mm at the same magnification. In the camera, the minifig is much more tightly framed than before because this lens has a longer focal length and therefore a more narrow field of view. But I've got a lot more room to work with around the lens without having to change the magnification. It's also easier to light the subject with this LiQWYD Pro or sunlight. So the first lens I showed you was my 30mm 3.5 Sony. This lens has a minimum focusing distance of 9.5 cm or about 3.8 inches at 1:1 magnification. It's on the wide angle side of focal lengths, which means a wider field of view. So I use this when I want more of the environment in my shots. My 70mm 2.8 Sigma is my default lens because it gives me a comfortable working distance. And that's important to me because I work with lights and atmospheric effects. At 70mm, this is a telephoto lens, so the angle of view is narrow and you get less of the environment in the frame. I have 2 other lenses that I'll go over briefly before we do an image comparison. This is a vintage 50mm f4 SMC macro Takumar. It's all metal and heavy. It's a highly regarded lens that can achieve 1:2 magnification, so not a true macro lens. It's also manual focus only. The aperture is also controlled on the lens, not the camera body, by turning this dial. And since this is made for another mount system, I've added an adapter so that I can use it with my Sony camera body. The first macro lens I ever bought was this vintage 100mm f2.8 Minolta. It's also built like a tank, and the barrel extends out when I turn the focus ring. It's a true 1:1 macro lens. It's not a native mount lens though, so I need an adapter to use it with my Sony camera bodies, and this one made by Sony is not cheap. So now you've seen all 4 of my macro lenses, let's compare some images. I took some photos of a minifig silhouetted with bokeh because everybody wants to know about bokeh, right? Right. Okay, I admit that was fun. I didn't move the minifig or the lights, but I did move the camera to frame the subject the same way. This is a 30mm at 3.5. This is a 50mm at f4. This is a 70mm at f2.8. And this is a 100mm at f2.8. Side by side, you can see what I mean about the different fields of view and how that affects bokeh. The 30mm has a lot more of the environment in the frame, and the lights in the back look much smaller and distant. As the focal length increases, the field of view gets more narrow and the bokeh gets larger. I did the same series of shots, but this time I closed down the apertures of each lens to f5.6. You can see that the bokeh gets noticeably smaller for the 50, 70, and 100mm shots. The shapes of the bokeh also change drastically in the 50 and 100mm shots. There is a more subtle change in shape in the 30 and 70mm shots, but they are there. This is because the lights are taking the shape of the aperture itself. Wide open, the aperture looks more like a circle. When it's stopped down, the blades move in and you can see their edges. So that's macro lenses in a nutshell. Macro lenses are specialty lenses and are designed to be very sharp at a very close distance. There are regular lenses that can get you in close enough, but they won't likely be as sharp. There are more things to consider when choosing a macro lens, like focus breathing, aperture range, diffraction, and focus throw, but that's for another video. I'll see you back here for more toy photography. This is 4 Bricks Tall.